right, welcome to the school board meeting. If everybody please stand for Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, I'm having a senior moment. Brian and Samantha are dialing in on the phone. They're in. And Amy may be joining later, and Mrs. Ravenfeld is not available this evening, so. All right, we met in executive session for some legal and personnel issues. Before the meeting, Secretary's correspondence, nothing. IU report.
The intermediate unit meets this Wednesday. I will have a full report at our next meeting.
Mrs. Ravenfeld does the legislative report, and she's not here this evening. So we're going to get right to the fun part and have the student councils come up. So we have two here tonight. Charlestown's first on my list, so we'll start with them.
Hi, I'm Julia Cook, the president of the Charlestown Student Council. We are so excited to return tonight to share about the amazing events going on at Charlestown. Thank you to Dr. Speaker Polovinsky and the board for inviting us. A lot of work has been done at Charlestown since the last time we met. Our primary project is making a difference in the lives of ill children. This year at Charlestown, Student Council is working with Bob Kelly to raise money to help the Nemours AI DuPont Hospital for Children. We held several meetings to work on this project. We organized and planned an assembly to present this idea to school. We had Bob Kelly come and talk about why he started the BK 5K race. We created flyers, made announcements, and wrote up information in a Bulldog Blast. We are proud to announce we've raised approximately $1,200 of our $2,000 goal.
Hi, I'm Matthew Belmer, the Secretary of Student Council, in which I record the ideas of our members during our meetings. At Student Council meetings, we can give our ideas that we think which could work for fundraisers, traditions, and other things in and out of school. With a little help, we came up with the idea to help support the BK 5K race. When working on this project, we learned bigger life skills, such as how to share with a group and be creative and be collaborative. We learned how to encourage participation and skills that we may use in meetings later on in life. This is why Student Council is amazing and helps us grow.
Hi, my name is Jackson Malconian, and I'm the Vice President at Charlestown. Our school wants to continue to work towards raising $2,000 for the Nemours AI DuPont Hospital. In our last meeting, we spent time thinking of another fundraiser to reach this goal. One of our ideas was working with the PTO. For every Just Right book students read, PTO will donate $1. Another idea is with our gym teacher, Mr. Steve. In this idea, if you donate money, you will get a $1 million check, which is a special recognition in his class. We plan on meeting with Mr. Vaquel and the PTO will donate, and we'll help finalize those ideas soon.
Hi, I'm Danny Gardner, and I am the Treasurer of Student Council. This year at Charlestown, we are doing other positive things, in addition to raising money for a good cause. This year, we are planning to do positive notes for PSSAs. We plan to say things like, nice job, or you can do it. Our goal is to have a positive note on each child's desk on the first day of PSSAs. This is for sure going to get all 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade students to do well and feel good about themselves. Another thing we plan on doing for our Charlestown community is volunteering our help with field day. This includes coming in early to help our PE teacher, Mr. Steve, set up games and activities.
So there you have it. We've been busy. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share the exciting events at Charlestown. We appreciate all the work you do each month to support us. Have a nice night.
Thank you, guys. All right, General Wayne.
Good evening. My name is Abby Diamond, and I'm the president of the GWES Student Council. With me tonight is our Vice President Christian Hall, Secretary Raj Dillon, and Treasurer Nicholas Opelski. Thank you for inviting us to share some of the wonderful things happening at GWES. In December, we held our annual Jingle Ball necklace sale. We sold over 300 necklaces, resulting in sales of $332. 105 went to the Ronald McDonald House at AI DuPont Hospital, which paid for a family to stay for a week at no charge. This year, our school has done many projects for Ronald McDonald House, and even though they aren't specifically student council projects, we'd like to share them with you tonight. The students and staff have been collecting snap tabs all year. Ronald McDonald House collects and recycles these and uses the funds to help families in need. In February, each classroom also collected many items for families that need to stay overnight. Kids brought in snacks, paper pens, and personal other care items for people to use. Mrs. Citron, Mrs. Cook, and Ms. Van Anker took everything to the Ronald McDonald House, and we were very happy about GWES's large donation.
All of the student, staff, and teachers at General Wayne made a kindness pledge during the month of February. Students and the staff had the opportunity to purchase a kindness gram and give it to their classmates or friends in the school. The kindness grams cost $1 for $4. We were able to raise $125. We sold these kindness grams in our classrooms, and everyone was very excited when they received one. Our goal was to spread smiles and I think that was accomplished.
This year we have incorporated weekly spirit days in each Wednesday. The first Wednesday of each month celebrates our General Wayne Spirit Day by wearing green and white of the General Wayne Spirit wear. We also enjoy our Wednesdays of full of spirit. We also ran a raffle at Read Across America Night last week. We raffled off 2 books with a $25 Barnes & Noble gift certificate attached. We raised over $100.
Lastly, we are getting ready to begin our Cards That Care school-wide service project. Each student illustrates a picture that promotes kindness and our pillars of character, which are printed and created into a card. The students then color and create their 6-pack of cards, which are then sold. All proceeds support our General Wayne family in need. Thank you for inviting us, and we love to share our General Wayne pride this evening. We are honored. Have a fabulous week.
Well, thank you for coming. We're always happy to have the students here, so thanks. We have a few awards to give out, and I want you guys to stay and help applaud if that'll work. Is that all right? Take like 5 or 10 minutes, and then Mr. Adler's going to tell us about what's going on in high school. Then you can go home, okay? That work for you guys? All right.
Ritesh around? I think I saw him here. Ritesh, come on over here, bud. I'm actually here this evening just to acknowledge Ritesh Kodali. He's one of our 7th graders at Great Valley Middle School, and Ritesh has done a wonderful job at our local level B within our school district, and was then moved up to our county level, and the county level is spelling bee is ran and supervised by the Chester County Intermediate Unit, and I am pleased to announce that Ritesh earned 3rd place overall in the county for this year's Chester County Spelling Bee. So congratulations.
Good evening. On Saturday, February 9th, the Rotary Club of Phoenixville held its 7th annual Spelling Bee competition. The event supports local nonprofit charitable organizations across the county, and over 240 students registered to participate. KDM had a very strong showing with 46 students in attendance. 2 students from Katie Markley finished among the top 3 in 2 of the 4 divisions. In Division 2, second grader Isha Nair won 3rd place. Congratulations. And in Division 4, which is a combination of 4th and 5th graders, Mason Yang, 5th grader, also placed 3rd. I'd like to congratulate Isha and Mason for their hard work. Thank you, guys. Congratulations.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for the time to honor our students here. The National Merit Scholarship Program is an academic competition, recognition, and scholarship. High school students enter the National Merit Program by taking the preliminary SAT, National Merit Scholarship Qualifying Test, which serves as an initial screen for approximately 1.6 million entrants. In February, some 15,000 semifinalists were notified that they have advanced to the finalist standing. All the winners of the Merit Scholarship Awards are chosen from the finalist group based on their abilities, skills, and accomplishments. It is with great pride we announce this year's finalists from Great Valley High School. Daniel Hahn. Julia Hu. You go front. And Kimberly Yang. Sorry.
All right, welcome Ian. What's going on at the high school?
So as the winter sports season ends, we had some amazing finishes by some of our athletes and teams, including the swim team who went to states last weekend, and wrestler Ethan Seal who medaled at state championships last weekend. And there's also the beginning of new spring sports like track, boys tennis, baseball, and lacrosse this week. And this year's Mr. Great Valley competition was held last weekend, and it raised over $4,000, which is the most ever by any Mr. Great Valley competition, and was won by Andrew DeSanto. And finally, the High School Drama Guild will be presenting their spring musical, The Sound of Music, at the end of this month.
All right, thank you.
Could I ask a question, Mr. Adler? So could you tell us what happens to the money that's raised by Mr. Great Valley?
Yeah, so the Mr. Great Valley money goes towards the Ben Chrissy Character Counts Scholarship, which is awarded to one girl senior and one boy senior at the end of the year. And so the money will be split evenly, and the scholarship is given to students who show the 6 pillars of character and good citizenship throughout their high school years.
And we're honoring Mr. Chrissy. Why?
Because he was a Great Valley teacher and coach for many years, and he passed away. And so the Chrissy family, who's still part of the Great Valley organization, including Miss Chrissy, who's a biology teacher at the high school, decided to run this in honor of him so they could award seniors who demonstrate good character in Great Valley.
Thank you so much. That was a phenomenal explanation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. All right, General Wayne in Charlestown, you can grab your parents and leave if you'd like. Or you can stay if you want, but no.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hey, good job. I put pictures up already. They weren't here for you. Top loader.
Shocking.
They heard the bonds. I should have announced we were going to talk about bonds.
Right. Bring him in.
All right. Superintendent report?
I'll just go ahead and introduce, with us are Michael Lillis and Allison Mackey from RBC Capital Markets to do a little more detailed explanation of the concept I sort of laid out to you last month as we're getting into budgeting and looking forward as the feasibility study kind of rolls a little bit. We've had the first several meetings of that feasibility study. So, Mike, you've got the clicker there, and it's all ready to go. Just point this way. And sorry they all leave, so welcome to my world.
This on? Okay. I'm not going to touch it. Anyhow, so Chuck, thanks for the introduction. As Chuck said, Chuck related to us the kind of a brief analysis he did for you guys with the idea of how to phase in the millage of a major capital project. And one aspect of that was phasing in the millage actually before you actually issued the bonds. So we're going to, as Chuck said, go into a little more detail on that. We're going to use a different project amount, which we'll comment on in a minute. And we're going to show you some additional scenarios and hopefully not confuse you. So with that. Can I not turn this on? Should be on. Do I have to point this where? Ah, there we go. Oh, I was going the wrong way, okay. So, so before we get into the scenarios, we thought it might be helpful just to talk about some of the considerations in the analyses that we're going to talk to you about tonight. So as Chuck has mentioned, the district is contemplating possibly some major capital projects, first bullet point. And we talked about some priorities for the implementation of the financing of the project. One is building in the debt service over time in advance of any potential projects, which we talked about and just briefly, and Chuck had already shown you an example of that. And then the sub-bullet point there says phase in of needed millage increases over a period of years versus one large increase, especially under Act 1 constraints. If you do a big bond issue, you do a larger bond issue in just one of them, it stands to reason that the impact's going to be much greater than if you phase it in over time. And with Act 1 constraints, that that becomes an important factor. Managing the total payback versus millage impact, shorter debt service structures, et cetera, while maintaining affordability. What we mean by payback is the total interest and principal you pay over the life. And the millage impact is a function of the amount of the payments. And using an example of a mortgage, so if you borrow, if you're going to get a mortgage for 20 years, the payments are going to be, a certain level. If you go to 30 years, the payments are going to be lower, but you're going to pay more interest and principal over the life. So that's something to keep in mind. Generally speaking, if you do a bond issue and you have level payments each year, that is one important factor. And typically the goal is to find a balance between the two. I mean, I think it's fair to say that you typically try to have the borrowing term as short as possible, but it doesn't make the payments so high that it's unaffordable. So you try to find that kind of middle ground. Another point, limit the use of existing dedicated reserves in an effort to preserve/maintain favorable credit rating. As you may know from past bond issues, the rating agencies like the reserves to be larger, not smaller. The larger they are, the happier they are and the better your credit rating. And as you know, you have the highest rating that you can get, even though Chuck asked for a quadruple A and they decided they wouldn't offer that. Have to stick with the triple A. Yeah, really. So the idea here is you want to make sure that you wouldn't want to draw down your reserves so it would hurt that rating, because having that higher rating gets you the best interest rates. And let's see, mindful of relationship of financing to rating methodology for project. I guess it's basically what I just said, is that you want to make sure your reserves don't go below a certain point that affects your rating. Last point on the page, pre-planning and implementing millage increases in advance of the project. As Chuck demonstrated, when he showed you that one example, and we're going to show you a little bit more here, is that you can, by putting the mills in place before you issue the bonds or before you issue all the bonds, will allow you to save up some cash that you're not using already, yet to pay debt service. And with that cash, you can use it instead of reserves to reduce the amount of borrowing and reduce the impact of the project to the budget. Okay, so I asked Chuck to put this slide in here. This is what he had showed you as part of a brief presentation, and I thought it might be helpful just to go through this real quickly. So in this analysis summary, he assumed the project would be $50 million. So if we look at the first fiscal year, 2019-20, he said, all right, we're going to put in the budget $1 million, and the percentage to your, the increase in a percentage of your existing millage is 1.1%. So that's something, you could count, you can weigh against your, what's the word, the index. Because that's, as you know, is a percentage figure. So in fiscal year 2019-20, the $1 million that you put in the budget, you can now set that aside. We're showing in the next column because you're not paying any debt service yet. The next fiscal year, 2021, we're going to increase the budget amount for debt service by another $1 million. So it's now $2 million. That $1 million increase is the same percentage approximately increase as you did in the previous year. And in that budget year, you'll be setting aside $2 million that you're not using for debt service. Going to the last column, you'll have a total of $3 million in reserve for the project, counting in the $1 million you had from the year before's budget. Then in the third year, in 2021-22, you increase the budget amount $1 million more, and you have $3 million now in the budget, same basic percentage of increase, and now you'll have $3 million that you can set aside to use to reduce the amount of borrowing. And together with the funds that you set aside in the two previous years, you have a total of $6 million to use to offset the financing of the $50 million, which means you roughly, you would be financing about $44 million. And here we're assuming that the issue would be done in fiscal year 2022-23, and the first impact to the budget would be actually in the same year, and And actually, based on the example he gave, the payments would be a little less than the $3 million you put in the budget, here, 2.8 million. And actually, you know, you'd have a little reduction in the amount you're budgeting for debt service. And as I mentioned earlier, the total amount you now only have to borrow is 44 million. And in that little gray box at the bottom there, he notes that by doing this, you've saved over $7 million in total principal and interest over the life. So I think that was a good example to start with on how we might apply that to a larger amount. And we're also going to look at some different payment scenarios, if you will, different structure. Before we get into the scenarios that Ally's going to talk about, we thought it would be helpful just to show you a breakdown on an annual basis of the district's combined debt service for all its issues. And if you start in this current fiscal year in column 7, you can see the amount of debt service you have is 5.1 million, stays that way basically for the first 3 years, and it drops down about 700,000 in 2022, drops down less than $1 million to 3.6 million in the following year, then down to 2.9 million, and then you can see it basically goes away in the next few years. What's important about that is that you have debt service and not, that's going to be reducing over time, and it's not, you know, it's only a few years in which it actually goes down to zero. And what that can allow you to do is actually minimize the budget impact of the borrowings, and it's something Ally's going to talk about. Okay. Here you go. So that's going further. Yeah.
Good evening. I'm going to go through a couple of pages here of very detailed scenarios. So I'll walk through the first one column by column so we kind of know what's going on. Then I'll kind of give you the higher level overview on the differences between the scenarios. But if you have any questions, please stop me because there's a lot of numbers on this page and I understand if it's not quite as easy to follow as I think it is. The first scenario imagines a world where you don't do anything, you don't put any money in the budget now or before you do this borrowing in 22 or 23. It also assumes that you're going to fund a $90 million project. We pulled that number out of a hat. There's no magic to it. The number will be whatever you and your architects decide the project is and what the number is. But we kind of wanted to show you a more realistic scenario of what people around this area are financing in terms of major capital projects. So in all these scenarios, at the end of the day, you have a pot of money of $90 million to do your projects.
Let me just jump in real quick. We met with the architects last week. This is closer to actual. We got a number, Kenny was there, Jim was there, Stephen was there. That's it from this group. You were on the phone. So a small building, like a small elementary school type building, not a middle school, not a high school, it's about $45 million, not counting all the other stuff you have to do. So when they say 90 million, it's probably not too far. Mine was, I remember I told you last month, mine was probably conservatively low and you gasped. So, sorry.
Oh, no. Another important kind of all-encompassing assumption in these scenarios is that we have static interest rates. We've built in a current interest rate, but we've also added 50 basis points of contingency to it to be a little bit conservative, but we haven't added more for things that occur further out in time because we wanted you to be able to see the impact that the cash has on the borrowing kind of apples to apples without factoring in more complicated scenarios. So for now, this would be kind of what you could borrow at today, probably something a little bit less because we do have a contingency, but in the future, who knows? So if we start at the left, column 1, just as your fiscal year end each year. Column 2 ties to the page prior to this that Michael just talked about with your current debt service like it exists today, falling off there till it totally pays off in 2030. Step 3 would be, or I'm sorry, column 3, step 1 would be that you would wait until you're ready to embark on this project and you'd borrow all $90 million at once. You would do one big bond issue out there in 2022, 23, and the debt service associated with that is what's shown in column 3. In column 4, we have nothing there because you don't need any capitalized interest or cash to phase in any debt service over your existing debt service in this scenario. And then column 5 would be your new total debt service when you add columns 2 and 3 together. Column 6 shows you where you have to be in terms of a budgeted gross dollar run rate for debt service in any of those given years. Column 7 shows you when you bring that debt online, how much you need to add to the budget in that year to be able to cover the debt service associated with it. And then column 8 just converts that into mills based on your current value of a mill, which is $3,850,000. Column 9 then basically deducts column 5 from column 6. So in any given year where you have more debt service budgeted than you need, you'll throw off a surplus. So as you can see here, as a function of the level debt service structure, because you're not taking advantage of that fall off in your debt, you're just saying, I'm gonna add another 20 years of debt on top of it. You actually don't utilize all of the debt service you've put in place there. You spin off roughly just less than $3 million in all of those out years because you're doing a level structure here, which you'll see the difference when we get to scenarios a little bit further down. The other thing to notice, and there's a blue box around it, is that when you do eventually get out there where your debt starts to fall off, you do create a surplus just by virtue of having $5.1 million in your budget and then having some of that debt fall off. We assume you don't just put that in an account somewhere or under the mattress, that you invest it, so we've kind of made this little calculation off in columns 10, 11, and 12, where we assume that you earn about 250 basis points on that cash that's sitting there for the amount of time it's sitting there before you do the bond issue. We also assume that you wouldn't just leave the cash there, you would apply that towards your project come time and decrease the amount that you're borrowing by whatever the amount of cash in that box is at the end of time there. So in this case, you have roughly $670,000, you would decrease your borrowing by that amount, which is factored into column 3. So the 2023 year, where you have all that debt service come online because you haven't put anything into the budget ahead of time, you get out there, you need to fund this debt. That roughly is a 3.8% increase in that year that you would need to budget. And that is problematic because at least this coming year, your Act 1 index is only 2.3%. So that's the reason most districts don't just wait to get out there. They have to plan in advance under Act 1 because they don't have enough space in their budget to be able to do it all at once like this. Does anybody have any questions on scenario 1? Okay. Then we'll
Yeah,
move-
this is Samantha Glenn on the phone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Just a couple. I have 2 questions, and one is it typical that a debt like this, if it were $90 million, would be paid off over 20 years? Is that typical of districts? And then my second question is in column 7, the 2024 line, where you see the budget increase is $3.8 million. There's nothing after that. Is that because once you've increased it, or are you saying that's the amount? Once you've increased it once, that's the amount you would need every year to achieve the proposed what we need in 5, or what we need in 6 rather?
Yes. So to your first question, we see the term that you borrowed over is directly related to the average life of the asset being financed. If it's a building, it's possible that you might do something longer than 20 years, but 20 years is kind of a place where we always start, and we can make it longer depending on what your council says and what exactly is being financed in the project, which we don't know yet. So that definitely could be something that could be extended over time, depending on what the project actually looks like.
And we've varied our borrowing. Michael could tell you from most of the time it's been 20 years when we've done big borrowing. Sometimes it's been as short as 10 years. I think we had one 15-year when I do think we did have one 15-year. But generally 20 years kind of levels it out, gets you to the late, I mean, that's why we're done paying off the bonds that Mike and I did in the mid-90s, right
You're
now.
going to see in some further additional scenarios that I was going to go through, there's a way you could actually borrow less than 20 years, and it could be beneficial to you. We're using a different structure rather than level payments in each year.
And then for the second question, that is correct. Once you put that debt service into place in fiscal year 23-24, you would then be over the hump for your max annual debt service year, and everything underneath that, as you can see, is throwing off a surplus, so you'd have enough in the budget at that point that you wouldn't need to increase anything after that point.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Welcome. All right. All right, scenario 2. The only difference between scenario 1 and this scenario here is that instead of saying that we get out to 2022, 23, and then borrow it all at once, we decide to borrow it in phases. So we just assume that you did 3 equal issuances over 3 different fiscal years. Each one would fund $30 million worth of projects. The reasons that districts choose to phase in the debt service over several borrowings is to allow the millage to be kind of stepped in more gradually than having that one big block come due in that one given year. It also takes some of the interest rate risk off the table because you're going to lock in interest rates along the way, so it's kind of like a dollar cost averaging concept if you equate it to investing, that you're going to be able to take advantage of different markets along the way, maybe some higher, maybe some lower, but that you're not putting all of your eggs in one basket out there in 2023. And the last one is more logistical. A lot of architects will give you a project timeline that spans 2 years, depending on what you're doing, and maybe you don't need all that money up front, and you don't want to pay interest on all that money up front for all this time if you're not going to spend it down kind of as quick as you think you might. So a lot of people borrow it in pieces just to be able to, A, not pay interest on money they're not going to use right away, and B, sometimes there's change orders, things change over the course of the project, and you don't know what the actual total cost is going to be, so you may want to leave one issue out there to clean up the borrowing at the end and not over borrow at that point. So all reasons that people kind of elect this strategy. Again, in this scenario, we've assumed that there's nothing built into the budget in any previous year. So you basically start borrowing in 2020. You borrow again in 21 and a third time in 22. And because you're using your kind of drop off here to phase in a little bit of the debt service, you don't spin off any cash in this scenario. So if you look to the far right, there's no cash being generated, there's no cash available to downsize your project. So in this scenario, you borrow a full $90 million, which is why it looks like it's a little bit more expensive than the previous option. And then in addition to that, you do have a more manageable millage phase-in over 4 years. However, it's still, not something that's not substantial. $1.4 million, $1.3 million, and then that $770,000 on the back end there. So overall, a more expensive borrowing option, but again, good reason to phase it in kind of on other merits of the project. Anybody have any questions about?
I just want a point for clarity.
Sure.
So in scenario 2, we're borrowing a third a year for 3 years.
Yes.
And then we're phasing in the millage.
Over 4 years,
Over
yes.
4, okay,
Yeah.
thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, then we'll move to scenario 3, which is the first scenario where we assume that the district puts millage into place ahead of the project actually being funded. This particular scenario is going to kind of match up with scenario 1 in terms of you're going to do one big borrowing, you're going to do it in 2022, 23, and what happens in that scenario. So in this case, we've taken Chuck's $1 million that he had in his slide, built it in every year in 2020, 21, and 22. And then, as you can see over in column 9, we're spinning off those surpluses that Chuck mentioned that we can then put into an account, earn interest on, and use to downsize your borrowing when it comes time. So over in the very far right column, you'll see there's $6.913 million available. You would use that and downsize the amount you borrow to $83 million. And again, do it on a 20-year level basis. In this case, because you have debt service that currently isn't low enough in 23-24, and you're layering on another full payment with this level payment structure on top of that, you actually need $632,000 worth of cash in column 4 in that blue box to get over the hump there, to where your millage then will be in place to fund the rest of the debt. Just from a timing aspect, the way that this scenario works out is that even after you've accumulated that $6.9 million, because you only have a half payment in that first year of 2022-23, where it's only $1.5 million, you actually spin off a surplus in that year. So you could allocate those funds in the blue box that says $2.8 million to pay this $632,000 that you would have to put into fund the debt service in 23-24. Just an option. It could come from anywhere. It could come from reserve capital reserve funds, any source. But just wanted to point out that you will have that extra cash spinning off that's not being put into the bond issue to be able to get over that hump there. When you employ this strategy, because you have to borrow less, because you've accumulated all that cash and downsized your borrowing by almost $7 million, you save approximately $8.8 million of total principal and interest repayment versus the first scenario where you didn't budget ahead and put anything in place and didn't have all that cash to be able to downsize the bond issue come time. Does anybody have any questions on number 3? All right. Scenario 4 is a mirror of scenario 2 again. We're just taking the same assumptions from scenario 3, where you have put the $1 million in your budget for those 3 fiscal years, and you use a phased approach versus a one-time borrowing approach. As you can see to the right, in this scenario, you've generated just over $3.5 million of cash by putting that cash into your budget. The reason that's lower than the previous scenario is because you are utilizing some of that surplus to phase in debt along the way, because you're phasing in debt service sooner under this phased approach. So you're not going to have quite as much cash available to you come 2022 when you do that final borrowing, but you do have something there. So if you look at the box below at the application, we've used just under $1.3 million of that cash to help you phase in debt service in column 6, where you needed it to get over your existing debt service hump. And then we've used the balance, the just shy of $2.3 million, to downsize the amount you need to borrow. So in this scenario, you're borrowing roughly $87.7 million. This saves you approximately $4.5 million versus the comparable scenario 2, where you didn't plan ahead. So again, applying any cash to downsize the borrowings in the future is beneficial to the district in terms of a total principal and interest repayment. Does anybody have questions on 4? All right. Scenario 5 is a scenario where we changed the structure of the bond issue. So here we, again, have assumed you put that $1 million into your budget every year leading up to 22-23. And here, we have, at the time that we go to borrow the money in one bond issue, $8.1 million in your budgeted debt service run rate. In the other scenarios, because we're doing a level structure, we're not using up all of that $8.1 million. You'll notice on the other previous scenarios in column 9, you always had some amount of money left over every single year because you're not utilizing all that money you put into the debt service line item. In this scenario, we use what's called a wraparound structure, so we don't overload the principal where you already have principal in your existing debt, and we wrap it underneath to the extent that we don't blow through your 1.2 million, but we utilize all of it, which allows us to shorten the structure up 6 years and have your final maturity in this structure be 2037 versus 2043. Excuse me. Again, this scenario, because you've put the millage into effect prior to the borrowing, you've spun off $6.9 million, which is the same amount of cash you spun off in scenario 3. And you're able to, again, shorten that final maturity. You don't need any cash to phase this option in, and you save approximately $14 million versus scenario 3, just by virtue of using that wraparound structure, because you've shortened your debt 6 years. There's 6 years less you're not paying interest on that larger amount of money. Does anybody have any?
So I have a question.
Yeah.
So I'm intently listening to all these scenarios. why wouldn't we do scenario 5? No, I'm asking, up to this point, why would we consider anything but scenario 5?
Nope, that's a great question. And I think it all comes down to, in my opinion, you would do scenario 5 or scenario 6, which is a hybrid of the same option with the phase-in. However, some boards like you would say, okay, there's a $6 million run rate, right, on my other option. So maybe the $1 million isn't $1 million that you put in the budget. Maybe it's something less that gets you to more of like a $7 million. It's all logistic around the project and what your goal is. So this is kind of laid out to help you think about what the impacts are when you consider those things.
See, I look at that one and I say it's a great scenario, but why are you shortening it? Like, see, I would wonder why you wouldn't take it to 20 years and lower your annual debt service, right?
Right, and yeah, I mean, and
You
it's
know what I'm
all,
saying? And it's all a matter of.
it's all a trade-off of what you want to.
Because I look at the other ones and I say, well, who cares? Why do I need a $2 million surplus on debt services? That's not what we're trying to do here, right? That would be a budget service, right? I mean, that we could use money for elsewhere. It's not really debt service. But in this case, why wouldn't you just structure it over the 20 years and level load your debt
Right,
service
and
to be?
there's a million iterations in between all of these that, when we had a bogey, if you said, I want to put $750,000 in the budget, I know I'm gonna borrow, or I have a project that's 90 million or 80 million, and we know we want to get at a run rate of X, we can certainly tailor that scenario. But here, I think we were just trying to show the impact of what those different nuances do to overall borrowing costs, to the amount of money you have to throw at the project at the end of the day.
And remember, our goal isn't for you to decide how we're borrowing it tonight. You're not. You're going to borrow, you're going to do this borrowing in 2 or 3 years. Our goal is to get you
Thinking
to
about it.
understand the concept of doing something early. You still have the decision to do that. I mean, early on, 20-some years ago, when Mike and I did these before, we didn't wrap because we had no debt to wrap. You know, so we were pushing debt out. It wasn't until we started doing some refinancing that we did some minor wraps. But, you know, at this point now, this is really just the conceptual idea that, you know, obviously, starting early, like a college fund, the less you have to pay, Phil, you'll be paying attention. You have 6 or whatever for college. But, you know, the earlier you start putting money away toward the college fund, even when they're in elementary school or middle school or whatever, the less you pay in the long term, so.
Actually, Dave, on scenario 5, if you lengthen the borrowing term of 20 years, it would actually be a greater impact, which may not be easy to understand. I'll try and explain it, is that we've made this the structure of the debt service that you're not paying virtually any principal in, let's see, in the first several years. This actually is the minimum budget impact for this type of structure. If you lengthened it, what it does is it causes the interest rate to go higher. The longer term you borrow, the higher the rate. So what this would do in effect, it would actually raise your impact. Maybe another thing that may help better understand it, when you have a mortgage and you go from 20 to 30 years, the way you're able to lower the debt service is that you reduce the principal in each year. Okay. In this, there's no principal basically in the early years, so you can't reduce the principal any further. All you can do is increase the interest rate, which raises the impact. So this is the most efficient.
But see, I look at it, I mean, the reason I say it is because I look at these first few scenarios, right? And you've got debt service surplus. And to me, that says, why would you worry about a debt service surplus, right? That's just, so essentially what you're doing is saying you're getting over the initial hump.
Right.
And you're keeping it at that level the entire time. Well, that's not really debt service. That's money that's got to be spent elsewhere, obviously, or can be spent elsewhere. It's just, it's not, you know.
And I think what we were trying to do here is show you apples to apples, so we had the $1 million. Clearly, if this was the structure that you wanted to go with, we wouldn't put $1 million, and we'd put something that was
Yeah.
less than that.
Yeah, like Chuck said, we haven't decided what we're gonna do.
Right, exactly.
Might be
So,
0, might be 2 million, who knows?
right.
Right?
No, but what this does, though, is you're really giving us, well, me anyway, I'll just say me, you're really putting this in a way that makes sense. That's,
thank
I can understand the impact, I see what the different scenarios are and what they mean. No, this is great, so
thank
I'll
you.
let you go on.
Thank you. And again, we can, once you have a better handle, we can tailor this.
Can you hear me? I have a question on the phone, Samantha. Yeah, I'm right where Ellen was about 5 minutes ago. I just, it sounds like what we've seen so far, and I know we're not deciding on whether or not to wrap debt. We're looking at, do we try and raise some funds before we have to get into debt? I understand that's a topic for tonight, but it's good to be able to foresee what we could and couldn't do in the future. And Ellen, said this what we've seen so far seems to make the most sense. So my question, sort of to what she was saying, because I didn't fully understand the answer, was, so what are the cons to this? Why wouldn't someone do this? What's the downside of doing it this way, wrapping it?
Should we go through all the scenarios first?
Yeah, but I'm kind of like, can we finish all the scenarios, because we might all fall in love with scenario 6, and we're asking very specific scenarios, and we're not actually.
We'll come back to that answer, Samantha.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah, we'll come back.
Okay, we can address it, yeah. All right, so does anybody else have anything else on scenario 5 specifically? Okay, then we'll move to scenario 6. And scenario 6 is, again, just the same scenario as scenario 5, but instead of doing one large borrowing out in 22-23, we do that phased-in approach where we do it kind of in thirds over 3 years. We utilize some of that cash to phase in the millage ahead of schedule. And so at the end of the day, you have just shy of $5 million in the pot. You are able to downsize your last borrowing by roughly that amount. And you still maintain a 2037 maturity in this scenario, so you're not extending your debt any longer than the previous scenario. But again, this gives you that flexibility to size your project correctly, lock in interest rates along the way, all of those good things we talked about earlier. And this option saves roughly $13.1 million versus scenario 4, which would be the comparable level debt scenario. Anybody have any questions on 6? All right, I am going to turn it back over to Michael to go over the last 2 slides.
Thanks, Ally. So on slide 10, we thought it might be helpful to show you how the debt service for each of the 6 scenarios compare and what the millage impact is for each. So a couple things I want to mention. If you look at scenarios 1 and 2, which was without any phasing in of any millage in advance or otherwise, you can see that the millage impact are pretty similar to a little over 1 mil. But all the other scenarios are, 0.77 mils. So what that tells you, I think, is that by each of those last 4 scenarios, by putting mills in advance for debt service, you save that money in the interest earnings on it, and you can reduce the size of the borrowing. And then I think another important thing is that, scenarios 5 and 6 is the wrap structure that Ally was talking about, and 3 and 4 was the level debt service structure. And you can see if you look at the total debt service, both the wrap schedule save you $7 million in interest over the life of the issue. Downside with the wraparound is that your debt service is, if you use level debt service, at a time in the future, your actual combined debt service would go down. So you would have more room later, if you will, to wrap future issues around it. So, that's an issue that, districts wrestle with versus minimizing the impact, minimizing the total principal and interest over the life with a wrap structure. I mean, districts are typically looking at both kinds of structures, and it just ends up being what's your priority for the effects of each. And that's something that, our plan is to try and help you with that. as you go along.
I mean, the biggest thing we have going for us is, from a millage point of view, right, is that in a few years, we've got debt rolling off.
Exactly, that's huge.
Right, so the wraparound, as we're talking
You
about.
take advantage of that.
Is huge, because basically about the same time we're gonna start borrowing, our previous debt, a year or two later, is gonna be falling off. And so therefore, the impact on taxes is reduced tremendously. It's not like we have to start at zero and go up. We've got some rolling off, so.
And down the road, even though you're using this wraparound structure, you can use a wraparound structure later too.
Sure.
It would be a little bit more of an impact if.
I think we did that
But that's
5-6 years ago. Yeah, we did that. Yeah.
So, yeah, a lot of districts find the wraparound structure appealing because of, the reasons we're showing, yeah. Exactly.
The question on these summaries is back to Samantha's, is the pros and cons of, not necessarily each one, but
Like,
Which one do you
why
think-
wouldn't you do a wraparound structure?
yeah, well, everybody's talking about five. Right, and we talked about the pros, but what are the cons to 5, for instance? And 6 is a little different than 5, only in the
Scenario
fact
5,
that-
what's the con against
Yeah,
scenario 5?
why wouldn't you do 5 versus?
Yeah, I mean, and I think, go back to something I think Ally may have mentioned, is that if you borrow once, obviously the benefit is that if you wait till all the millage is phased in, you have this cash to reduce the size of the issue. The downside is that it basically has to do with level of interest rates. So what you're doing is you're taking the risk for the interest rate for the whole borrowing at one specific time. So that's kind of the downside. I mean, the upside could be if they're great, then that would be an upside. And that's, that could be a consideration here.
I mean, part of what I'm thinking about is right now, because I don't want to get too wrapped up in all of the details of these, because we don't have to make that kind of decision right now for us as a board. I think the biggest decision we have to decide right now is, do we see value in pre-funding? I mean, and for me, the value is clearly there in pre-funding. And that's really how we decide scenario 5, 6, 90 million, 50 million, 86 million. That all isn't a decision we have to make right now. The decision we have to make now is there value in setting money aside that is in a dedicated reserve to reduce the bond issue, and for me, I see tremendous value in it. How we end up with using it exactly,
But I think
we're
the
not ready
advantage-
for that.
It's almost a no-brainer, really.
Right. Well, I think the
that's-
advantage of
Yeah.
what he's shown us in these scenarios is, right, the first couple scenarios have a millage requirement of just over 1 mill, right? Where if we pre-plan, we're only looking at 0.8 mils.
Right, and that's essentially, that is 1 year's worth of the Act One index, just about, give or take.
Right.
So that's really, on options 3, 4, 5, or 6, however you want to do it, doesn't matter. It's just a matter of whether you're going to pre-fund or not. If you pre-fund, the long-term impact on the taxpayers, should you have to do something, and you will have to do something, is mitigated slightly. Okay, you're
Well, it's
you're at
0.2 mil, right?
75% of what it could be. And like Michael said, if you're getting this stuff early, and, there's some cost to the wraparound. You're putting a lot more bonds on a longer people that are buying bonds, you're buying a 20-year bond now, which costs more money because you're paying bigger interest rates than a 2-year bond. 2-year bond's low, 20-year bond's high, so we're paying interest on that. So the wrap, that's part of the cost of the wrap, is you're putting more out. But the savings is clearly, and again, I don't want us to get into the weeds here of deciding which scenario it is. It's really just to get you understanding the comfortability of, do we put some money in there this year? I don't care how much it is. 0 million, somebody said 2 million, I don't know if we can do that, but close. But whatever you want to do, obviously, the more the better, and you would be able to stop it earlier then, and depends on feasibility study and the enrollment projections, we're guessing a build-out in 2022, 23, I mean, it could be 2021, 22, then obviously things change, but you still have the benefit of pre-funding a year or two of this debt.
Now we're building the budget. What are we going to see in the budget as you're building it as it relates to this?
Well, for those that paid attention last week, I had $1 million in the budget for the for this for next year already.
Correct,
We
but will
reduced-
that change based on this conversation or?
No, absolutely,
Okay.
absolutely not.
Unless we decide not to fund it.
Well,
The only
first
thing
off,
that
it's
would
really
change-
not part of the budget, other than the fact
only
that we're
thing that
adding
would-
taxes to put money into a reserve.
Right, the only thing that would change is if at the work session on April 8th, we go over the budget again in a little bit, and you say, that's too much, or why don't you put in another couple $100,000 or whatever, right, so.
Okay, so it's going to
It's not
stay at the
impacting our
million,
spending at this point.
No.
depending on what we decide as we roll along. Okay, that's what I needed to know.
And it will be a good company, I mentioned this, almost every district that's a major capital project is trying to advance funds because they have to under Act One. One that comes to mind in your backyard, Upper Marion's building in high school, they've been planning and putting millage into their budget for the last 3 or 4 years to be able to get that in, under their index, so, you know, it's not something people want to do.
As a slight variation on Samantha's question, because it's really not about whether scenario 5, the pros and cons, it's really about the pros and cons of pre-funding. At this point, in this juncture in time, it's really not about is 5 better than 6, is 4 better than 5, it's about is pre-funding better than not. And for me, and also from your comments, I see no real downsides in this moment to pre-funding. So, because it's not like we're never gonna need this building. It's a question of, do we need it in 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 4 year? That's really the question, and that's a question for us for a little bit different meeting time as we build in, like Chuck said, is $1 million enough? Is it too much? But that's not really this meeting. And I'm not seeing any downsides other than the tax increase a little bit earlier to the pre-fund.
Anybody got any more questions for these guys?
That's there
Yep.
No, it makes,
Yeah, Mike's got one more slide, which is I will kind of say they're your elevator points as to
Yep.
why you need to consider this.
Yep.
you want me to go through them, or? Some of them we've covered. So on slide 11, main takeaways. So the first one, not planning ahead for significant capital projects will require more significant millage increases that may not fit under the district's allowable Act 1 index, which we talked about. Allows you to not have to deal with the Act 1 limitation. Second one, utilizing a level debt structure results in a lower annual debt service run rate, but a longer final maturity date. And you remember that if you stretch it level over 20 years that we use in this case, the payments go down after your total debt service goes down after your existing debt goes away. That's the advantage with the level debt structure, but as we're saying, you do have a final maturity that's longer, and you end up paying more principal and interest over the life. And I guess to add to that sub-bullet, cash may be required to phase in new debt until the existing debt service portfolio has a significant decrease, which is solely due to setting aside the mills in advance. Utilizing a wraparound debt service structure allows the district to use up allocated debt service and pay off debt service sooner than the level debt structure, which we talked about. With the wraparound, you have a shorter term and it goes away sooner, payments go away sooner, and you have lower total debt service. And the wraparound also reduces the need for cash to phase in new debt in concert with existing debt portfolio. You saw in those examples where you had to take some money out of the cash that you had set aside. You don't need to do that with this. And lastly, phasing in debt service over time allows the district to lock in interest rates along the way while waiting to do one issuance exposes the district to additional interest rate risk, either positive or negative, which I think we mentioned a little while ago. Just one issue, whatever the rates are at that particular point in time, that's what they're going to be. With 3 issues, you're spreading your risk out over, in this case, 3 years. So that could be beneficial to you. Ally was mentioning Upper Marion Area School District. I was just thinking that Gettysburg Area School District, which is, not local, but what makes me think of them is that they've used this approach for 2 of their past major projects, one of which was before Act 1. So they saw this approach as being beneficial way back then. And they're planning another large project, which they've started setting mills aside 3 years ago. And I think in another year, they'll have enough mills in place. So they can say and it's true that there's no tax increase when we issue the bonds because it will have already been in place. Any,
Samantha or Brian? Nobody? All right.
Thank you again, honestly. It really helped me a lot. Ally, thank you.
Yes.
Michael?
Thanks. All right. Secondary school start time discussion or update?
Yes, we have actually had some conversations, and the secondary start time has been discussed, and in recent surveys and feedback, it was brought up again, are we looking at and are we considering delayed start times based upon the current research that has been shared around adolescent need for more sleep? So in those considerations, I just wanted to remind us of the background and where we are today. So there was a presentation to the board. It would have been in the spring of 17. It was actually when the CCIU student leadership representatives had explored start times, and they presented to the board the research from the American Academy of Pediatricians that recommended all secondary students and secondary start times for middle school and high school should be at 8:30 or later. So that research was explored and shared, and it actually started in Texas, where many of the schools adopted that start time. Two schools within Chester County, actually Unionville had started first, and then Phoenixville to begin next year adjusted their start times. Both school districts' current or original start times were much earlier than ours. So our current start time is 7:40 for homeroom. Our first period at the high school begins at 7:52. The adjustments that were made at Unionville, their start time is now 8 o'clock. They moved, I believe, from 7:10 to 7:20 to 8 o'clock. I believe that was the adjustment that was made. Phoenixville was at 7:20 and they've moved to 8:05. Again, the research suggests 8:30 or later, along with some behavioral changes that are impacted, such as no use of electronics the night before, an hour prior to sleep, don't use your device as an alarm clock. So there are many other behavioral changes that have nothing to do with the start time of school, that actually have to do with getting a more solid sleep. But that said, where we are now, that's our current start time in our first period at the high school. The other areas of consideration are instructional time. As districts explore the possibility of delaying start time, it impacts the dismissal time. Currently, across the Commonwealth, many of our sports teams, in order to get games in, especially in the spring, and those games that are played outside in daylight, there are early dismissals for students for athletics and activities. So that's a consideration, that when districts are exploring this possibility, looking at if you delay the start time and then you extend the dismissal time, the loss of instructional time will be greater for those students that are dismissed early. There is also, currently in our situation, we have two bus runs. We have an elementary bus run and a secondary bus run. By law, by legislation, we are required to transport students that attend non-public schools. So currently, our secondary run includes those students that are transported to non-public schools within up to 10 miles from the borders of our district. So that is legislation, and that we are currently transporting to approximately 100 non-public schools, approximately 1,000 students, Chuck? So approximately 1,000 students are transported that are not Great Valley School District students, but live within Great Valley School District attendance areas. So if we were to consider, and that's one of the conversations that we had back when the presentation was made, that would certainly be an area to consider due to the cost of changing those transportations and the impact of our current transportation of students. So currently where we are as a district.
Well, real quick,
Absolutely.
back to the start time. So even in this county, Unionville, who's moved their start time, and Phoenixville, who's moving it next year, their start time for their first period's only 8 o'clock, right?
Absolutely.
Right, so.
8
ours-
o'clock and 8:05.
Right, and ours is 7:52, so we're not, if we did what they did, we're talking 10 minutes or 15 minutes, which isn't really achieving much from the studies and everything. I just want to make sure everybody understands that it's a lot of conversation throughout the county, but in reality, they moved it mostly because they were so far behind. I mean, started so much earlier than we did. We're essentially where they're at now.
Absolutely.
I mean-
And understandably, if we started at 7:10, that would mean that many of our students would be arriving at school prior to 7 o'clock, which was the scenario in other schools, and in some still is. So our start time is closer to the range of where they are headed rather than the range of where they started.
Now, the data and evidence that I've seen, I've done a lot of research on this. It's very clear that without a lifestyle change at home, there is no benefit to changing school start times. It all works together. Like, for instance, you can say, well, we're going to make school later. And little Johnny and little Mary can say, well, okay, now we're going to start school later so we can stay up later. The data and evidence that I read shows that you need to get them ready for bed at a certain time to go to bed. I mean, it's a lifestyle change that we have no control over after our children leave us. So I'm not seeing the value of doing anything without the commitment of what needs to be done by the partner, the home partner. I've read everything says without the commitment of all the partners, there is no merit to just changing your start time.
Right, and that's what we came to 2 years ago, right?
Correct.
There's, I think, right?
And I think like any study or body of information, there is a range of factors which will impact. Where we are right now and moving forward, right now, Pennsylvania, and if Mr. Linderman advances to the next slide, in Pennsylvania, the legislation is now looking at start times across the Commonwealth. And folks that are sitting at the table and having the conversations represent school districts as well as PIAA, which is the sporting oversight, and also non-public entities, because there are many arms to this that are more involved than simply starting the time you start school. So that is happening right now, and what we had discussed previously was waiting for more information and waiting for potential legislative action. We are, to my knowledge, there is no specific voting that's taking place. Right now, it's in the conversational stage at the legislative level. When we do think about this, and actually other districts that are going down this path and having these considerations, they are looking at the instructional time because that is significant. So there are many different adjustments that have been made to address that, shortening all periods or adding a period at the end of the day that is more like a flex period or an activity period. So a lot of conversations are happening because this isn't only happening here, it's happening across the country. Discussions about start times for adolescents. So as we're considering, we have done and are continuing to do the projected impact and cost as it relates to transportation, as well as thoughts about instructional time. But I just wanted you to know that it is not an issue that we're not aware of and that we're not looking to consider and costing out, but we're certainly not at a point, for the reasons that were all shared previously and this evening, we're not at a point to implement any potential change.
And the other thing, it's also my understanding that, because some people say, why don't you just flip the secondary and elementary schools? That there are also many considerations with that that are not just about sports or about other timing or bus runs, but they're about people's family lives and who watch older children watching younger children. And so it's not as simple either as just saying, well, we'll let the elementary school kids start younger because that's when they get up, and we'll let the older kids go later. There's a lot of things happening in that I know you've shared, when we looked at this the last time, that you're also looking at in some of the districts who kind of rushed to do that are now suffering some of the parental feedback that maybe that wasn't the best choice to rush into.
Right, and one of the realities, unless non-public, right now, our secondary students, our public school students and not, our Great Valley School District students and our non-public students for the morning run are on the buses together. Having younger children on those buses with older children is also a concern that parents have expressed in other places. So there's certainly, we will continue to make sure we're looking at all avenues, but unless there's direction from the board to actually consider implementation, we are not at that point. We are monitoring, though, the costs and all of the variables that will be impacted. So if we are at any point ready to make changes, we can clearly articulate what the implications of those decisions would be.
And just one other, buses are not cheap. I mean, some people don't realize how much it costs to have one extra bus run a day, and it's not an insignificant amount of money. I think the last time, I don't know what it's up to now, because we haven't talked about it in a couple of years. Back then, it was like $78,000 a run. So I can't imagine that price has gone down. So just for the general public to understand that that's also, when you talk about costs.
So at this point, we'll continue to monitor, stay abreast of all the studies and what the state's doing and the rest of the county's doing, so. All right, at this point, we'll move on to the voting section of the meeting. So before we start, open the microphone up for public comment. So if anybody has a comment on any of the voting items, come to this podium and state your name and residency. All right, seeing none, do I have a motion for approval of 701 through 710?
Motion to approve 7.01 through 7.10 inclusive.
Second? Second. Any questions on any of these? All those in favor? Brian? Who's Brian?
Aye.
Yep, thank you. Samantha?
Samantha, you still there?
Yep. Motion passes 7-0. All right, next up is personnel items. A motion for approval of 901.
Move to approve 901.
Second.
Motion second. Any questions on these? All right, all those in favor? Brian? And
Yes.
Samantha?
Approved.
Yep. Motion passes 7-0. All right, policies. The first readings are there. Second reading will be for adoption and repeal. So do I have a motion to pass 1001 and, or excuse me, 1003 and 1004?
Motion to approve 1003 and 1004.
Second. Any questions? All those in favor? Samantha?
Approved.
Brian?
Yes.
I think that was a yes. Yes. Motion passes 7-0. All right, that's everything on the voting agenda. What? We're good? All right, any other, open the microphone up again if there's any other public comment. Welcome to come to the podium. All right, seeing none. Any other board comments? Samantha?
No, thank you.
All right, Brian?
No, thanks.
Can I actually just mention something? So this year, there are a lot of people running for school board. Are there any plans to host like a Meet the Candidate event? Like, would that be done through the school, or is that totally separate? The candidates would have to set something up if they wanted it?
The
Just
school's
putting it
always
out there?
stayed out of those events. There, over the years, there's been,
I just want to get,
yeah, the League
for
of Women
people who are
Voters, there's
new,
been-
what should they do?
yeah, usually, anytime it's been run by someone outside of the the school district. Schools try to stay out of it just from,
So if anybody here is a school board candidate, you heard us, we don't set up anything, so don't expect it from us, but please go outside, League of
Yeah.
Women Voters or whatever organization you
Right.
care to work with. And I would recommend doing that because the field is crowded in a good way.
yes, there's been, like I said, over the years, several different forums for it, so hopefully we'll see one this year. All right, and yes, there are, I think 8 or 10, we're not, candidates, so multiple candidates in each region, so.
Which is great.
Which is good.
And thank you.
Yes, and thank you. Steph keeps me in line. All right, any other board comments? All right, motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn. Second?
All those in favor?
Nope. Kidding.
Motion passes 7-0. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.